There comes a moment on the path of awakening when everything you thought you were begins to dissolve. The world no longer feels familiar. Your ambitions, desires, even your very identity, suddenly seem like fragile illusions. And in this strange silence, many feel something terrifying, as if they are dying. But this is not death of the body. It is the death of the self you once believed to be real. And just like the ancient phoenix consumed by fire before it rises again, this inner death is the gateway to rebirth. Spiritual traditions across the ages have spoken of this mystery. The Egyptians called it the second birth in the halls of Osiris. The Gnostics whispered of the death of the demiurge's chains. The mystics of India described it as moksha, the liberation from the cycle of illusion. Yet, despite these teachings, few truly understand why awakening feels like death before it feels like freedom. Perhaps you too have felt it, the crumbling of old beliefs, the strange emptiness when the things that once gave you joy no longer matter, the sense of losing control, as if the ground beneath your feet has disappeared. This is the shadow side of awakening, the dark night of the soul. And unless you know what it truly means, it can feel like madness. In this video, we will journey deep into this hidden passage of the soul. We'll uncover why spiritual awakening is inseparable from this inner death. We'll explore how ancient wisdom preserved this secret in myth and symbol. And most importantly, we'll see how you can navigate this transformation without fear, learning to trust the fire that purifies rather than destroys. So, stay with me until the end, because what may feel like the unraveling of your entire life could, in truth, be the birth of your most authentic self. Before we begin, let me ask you, have you ever felt this sensation of inner death, as if your old self was dissolving into something unknown? If yes, share your experience in the comments. I'd love to know how this mystery has touched your life. Long before modern psychology spoke of ego death, ancient civilizations had already mapped the terrain of inner transformation. They encoded it, not as mere philosophy, but as living myth, ritual, and sacred drama. To them, awakening was never a gentle process. It was initiation through death. Consider ancient Egypt. Within the Book of the Dead, the soul is guided through the underworld, facing trials and judgments before standing in the presence of Osiris. This wasn't just a manual for the afterlife. It was a metaphor for the initiate's inner journey. To approach divine truth, one had to die symbolically, shedding every false identity until only the eternal essence remained. The Greeks preserved this knowledge in the Eleusinian mysteries, secret rites where initiates reenacted the descent of Persephone into the underworld. For 9 days, they confronted the mysteries of life, death, and rebirth, emerging transformed, with an unshakable understanding that death was not an end, but a passage. Plato himself hinted that philosophy was nothing less than a preparation for death. In the East, the same theme echoes. The Upanishads describe the self as something veiled by layers of illusion, layers that must be burned away. Zen Buddhism speaks of Kensho, the sudden glimpse into one's true nature, often preceded by years of what feels like spiritual annihilation. And in Sufism, the mystic must undergo fanna, the annihilation of the ego, before merging with the beloved. Across these traditions, the pattern is the same. The old self must die for the deeper self to be born. The cocoon must break for the butterfly to fly. But here's the secret many overlook. This teaching was often hidden in symbols, guarded within mystery schools, because not everyone was ready to confront such a truth. To the unprepared mind, the idea of dying to oneself sounded terrifying, even dangerous. So why does awakening feel like death? Because the mind clings to what it knows. We mistake our thoughts, our names, our roles in society as the entirety of who we are. When awakening begins, those illusions start collapsing. To the ego, this collapse feels like execution, but to the soul, it is liberation. This is why mystics spoke in riddles, why they wrapped their wisdom in parables and myth, because only those truly seeking could endure the paradox. Death that leads to life, loss that leads to freedom, darkness that is not the end, but the womb of light. Here, let me share a reflection. Personally, I've always been fascinated by how every culture, no matter how distant, preserved this same truth. Could it be that they all tapped into a universal law of transformation, a law that governs both the soul and the cosmos itself? After all, even stars must collapse before they give birth to new galaxies, and I'd love to hear from you. Which of these traditions resonates with you the most? Egyptian, Greek, Eastern, or Sufi? Drop your thoughts below. Your perspective might illuminate something others haven't considered. If awakening feels like death, it is because the structures that once defined your identity begin to collapse. Imagine standing in a grand cathedral, built stone by stone over decades, only to realize the foundation itself is cracked. Suddenly, the walls tremble, the roof begins to fall, and the very sanctuary that gave you comfort becomes a prison. This is what happens when awakening begins. The architecture of the ego starts to crumble. But here's the paradox. Nothing real is ever destroyed. What dies is illusion. What dissolves is everything false you've been carrying, often without knowing it. The ancient mystics used the language of fire to describe this process. Fire consumes, yes, but it also purifies. It destroys what is temporary so that the eternal can shine through. At first, however, the experience is not bliss. It feels like disorientation, loss, and chaos. This is why many describe awakening as the dark night of the soul, a term rooted in the writings of the Spanish mystic Saint John of the Cross. He spoke of an unbearable emptiness, where prayers felt unanswered, where God seemed absent. Yet he insisted that this darkness was not abandonment, it was preparation. The false self had to die so that the true self could awaken. Think of a snake shedding its skin. From the outside, it looks vulnerable, even wounded. The skin cracks, peels, and falls away. But without that painful shedding, the snake cannot grow. Awakening demands a similar shedding. Old patterns of thought, toxic attachments, beliefs inherited from society or family, they all begin to loosen their grip. The process can feel terrifying because the ego screams for survival. This is why awakening often brings sensations that mimic death, the loss of meaning in things that once mattered, the collapse of ambitions, careers, or relationships that no longer align, the strange emptiness when pleasures no longer satisfy. Even the body itself may feel fatigued, as though it is grieving. But here lies the deeper mystery. Death and rebirth are not two separate events. They are one continuous movement. The moment the old self begins to dissolve, the new self is already stirring beneath the surface. Just as night gives way to dawn, your inner death is the hidden womb of your spiritual birth. And here is something I've noticed in my own reflections. This process isn't linear. It comes in waves. Just when you think you've died enough, another layer of identity begins to unravel. Awakening is not a single event, but an ongoing rhythm. Death, rebirth, expansion, then another death. It mirrors the cycles of nature itself. The falling of leaves in autumn, the barrenness of winter, and the sudden rebirth of spring. What makes this cycle so difficult is that our culture doesn't prepare us for it. We are taught to cling, to accumulate, to measure worth by stability and control. So when awakening strips these illusions away, we panic. We interpret it as loss rather than transformation. Yet if we could see through the eyes of the mystics, we would understand. What is dying is not you. It is only the mask you wore. Let me leave you with a question for reflection. If a part of your life were to crumble today, whether it be an old belief, a career, or even a relationship, would you see it as punishment or as the fire-clearing space for something truer to emerge? Share your answer in the comments. You may find that your perspective on loss shifts entirely. To truly understand why awakening feels like death, we must look beyond psychology and personal experience. We must peer into the archetypal and symbolic language through which ancient wisdom spoke. The paradox of death before rebirth is encoded everywhere, in myths, in alchemy, even in the cosmos itself. Consider the alchemists. They described the first stage of transformation as nigredo, the blackening. This was a state of decay, chaos, and dissolution, where matter lost its form. To them, the soul too must undergo nigredo, a symbolic death, before it could transmute into gold. No gold is born without first passing through darkness. In myth, this descent is often portrayed as a journey to the underworld. Inanna, the Sumerian goddess, stripped of her jewels and garments, passed through 7 gates to meet her own shadow in the land of the dead. Only after being broken, humbled, and symbolically slain did she return to the world of the living, radiant and renewed. Why does the soul require this descent? Because what is false cannot ascend. Imagine trying to climb a mountain with a backpack filled with stones of fear, shame, ego, and illusion. Awakening strips these stones away, but to the climber, it feels as if pieces of themselves are being torn off. The truth is, those stones were never you. Yet here is where many seekers stumble. They believe awakening should feel like light, joy, and constant peace. This misconception can make the dark stages even more unbearable. But the mystics remind us, light is born from darkness. The caterpillar's transformation into the butterfly is not graceful. Inside the cocoon, it dissolves into a kind of chaos soup before it reforms. If we applied our human logic, we'd call it destruction. Nature calls it metamorphosis. Another paradox. The more tightly you cling to who you think you are, the more painful the death feels. Resistance sharpens suffering. But surrender, trusting that the collapse has meaning, opens a doorway. And this doorway doesn't just lead to a new version of you, but to a recognition that you were never the old version at all. Let's also address a hidden dimension. Many spiritual seekers mistake awakening for escapism. They believe it will remove suffering or shield them from life's storms. But awakening doesn't remove suffering. It transforms the one who suffers. It dismantles the false identity that clings to pain and reveals the vast awareness beneath it. You still live, you still feel, but no longer as a prisoner of illusion. Now, a personal reflection. In my own studies and meditations, I've noticed that awakening mirrors the very life cycle of the universe. Stars collapse into black holes. Black holes themselves give birth to new galaxies. Death is not an interruption. It is the engine of creation. Could it be that our inner awakening follows this same cosmic rhythm? That the death we feel is simply the microcosm of the universe renewing itself within us? This brings us to the greatest paradox of all. The self you fear losing was never real to begin with. It was a story, a collection of roles and memories. What you are awakening into is not a better self. It is the timeless awareness that has been watching all along. This is why sages often describe awakening not as gaining something, but as losing everything false. And I want to invite you into a dialogue. Do you think spiritual awakening is about becoming someone new, or about realizing you were never the someone you thought you were? Share your thoughts below. I'm deeply curious to hear how you see this paradox. If awakening is the death of the false self, then the natural question is, how do we move through it without drowning in fear? How do we endure the fire of transformation without mistaking it for destruction? The first key is surrender. Not passive resignation, but conscious surrender. The willingness to let go of what is falling away. When old patterns, relationships, or ambitions begin to dissolve instead of clinging, ask, what is this making space for? A powerful practice is to sit in meditation and visualize yourself as the phoenix. With each breath, imagine the flames consuming outdated beliefs, leaving behind only the glowing embers of your essence. This simple ritual can reframe the fear of loss into the anticipation of renewal. The second key is shadow work. Awakening often brings suppressed emotions and forgotten wounds to the surface. Many people interpret this as regression, thinking they are going backwards. But this is the underworld stage, where the psyche reveals its buried fragments. Journaling is one of the most accessible ways to work with this. Each night, write down what emotions surfaced during the day: anger, sadness, fear, and instead of pushing them away, speak to them as if they were teachers. Ask, what are you here to show me? In time, the shadows lose their sting and their wisdom integrates into your being. The third practice is ritual death and rebirth ceremonies. These need not be elaborate. Even a simple act of writing down an old belief on paper and burning it can create a powerful symbolic shift. In many traditions, initiates buried themselves in the earth or spent nights alone in darkness, symbolizing the womb of death, before re-emergence. You can recreate a gentler version. Spend a few hours in a quiet, dark room with no distractions, letting the silence strip away the noise of the world. When you return to light, you'll feel the renewal more vividly. The fourth practice is cultivating trust in the cycle. One of the hardest parts of awakening is the emptiness, the in-between space where the old is gone, but the new hasn't fully formed. This is where many people give up, but nature teaches us that the seed must remain buried before it sprouts. You cannot rush the spring. A helpful daily mantra could be, I trust the process. Even in darkness, I am becoming. Speak it aloud when fear arises, and feel the words rewire your nervous system with calm. Finally, community is vital. In ancient times, seekers were guided through initiation by elders and mystery schools. Today, many attempt to walk this path alone, which can amplify the sense of isolation. Finding a circle of people who understand, whether through spiritual groups, online communities, or close friends who walk a similar path, can make the difference between despair and transformation. Share your experiences, listen to others, and you'll realize you are not dying. You are evolving. From my own journey, I've noticed that these practices don't eliminate the death feeling, but they transform your relationship to it. Instead of panic, you begin to feel reverence. Instead of loss, you feel release. And eventually, what once terrified you becomes sacred. Now, I'd like to ask you directly, if you were to design your own personal ritual of letting go, what would it look like? Would you write and burn old memories, meditate in darkness, or create something entirely unique. Share your idea in the comments. You might inspire someone else who is walking through their own fire. The journey of awakening is not the blissful escape many imagine. It is fire. It is dissolution. It is the death of everything you once clung to, as me. And yet, within this death, lies the most profound gift. The rebirth of your truest essence. From Egypt to Greece, from Sufi mystics to Eastern sages, the wisdom is unanimous. One cannot be born again without first dying to illusion. Awakening is not an addition, but a stripping away. It is the collapse of the mask, the shattering of false identities, until nothing remains but the eternal awareness that was always there. This is why it feels like death, because the ego cannot survive truth. But it is also why it becomes liberation, because what you truly are cannot die. The flames that terrify the ego are the same flames that reveal the soul. So if you find yourself in that in-between space, empty, uncertain, as though your world is dissolving, know this: you are not ending, you are transforming. You are in the sacred womb of rebirth. Trust the process. The ashes are not your grave, they are your soil. The phoenix does not rise in spite of its death, it rises because of it. And so will you. Before we close, I want to leave you with a question for contemplation. When you look at your life right now, what part of you is ready to die, and what part of you is yearning to be reborn? Sit with this question, and if you feel called, share your reflection in the comments. Your words may not only guide your own process, but spark recognition in someone else walking the same path. And if this message resonated with you, consider subscribing and joining our community. Because this channel is not just about knowledge, it's about walking the path of transformation together. Until next time, remember, death is not the end, it is the beginning.